So, Bill, we've talked about adding value, but that's a buzzword we all use in the industry. Give me something that really brings it home, tangible.
So I'll be specific. I did a build-a-suit with Timberland some years back. It was a big one. It was about 425,000 feet. It was a competition. I got to them through a board member on Circuit City, who was also on their board. And they were working with CBRE at the time. And I got to the right guy, and he gave me a shot at the business. Timberland's headquartered in New Hampshire. And the guy there were two guys in charge of the deal. One was a logistics guy, and the other was more of a finance guy. And they both had equal power in the decision making. They needed to build a suit within a year, and they needed it in a specific area that was a free trade zone. Now, as part of my preparation for the focus that I had, which was build a suit distribution, I made sure I knew who the most competitive contractors were. Mm-hmm. I made sure I knew who their job superintendents were. I made sure I knew who the most competitive architects were, and I made sure I knew who did the drafting. I also made sure I knew who the best civil engineers were, who had experience in the specific markets, because they changed from markets. I also made sure I knew what the entitlement issues were and what the cost of all those things are. And I had a simple sheet of paper. And the sheet of paper was oriented to cost, so I knew the shell cost for a building on a per square foot basis. Right. I knew the TI costs for low levelers and stuff like that. I knew the architect and engineering expense, and I knew what the entitlement timeline would be. I had this all done prior to even getting involved in the Timberland transaction. So when the Timberland guy came to town and I showed him the location, I also sat him down with the contractor. I also sat him down with the architect. I had prior relationships with both, and the civil engineer. I had prior relationships with all three of them. They knew what my focus was. They had been in my story room where I had so they knew I was a professional. So that when they sat down with me, with the contractor, the architect, and the civil engineer, I wasn't an antidote to the conversation. I was the leader of the conversation. Right. So my client saw me in that leadership role with these experts, the number one architect who had a resume for large distribution buildings that was unparalleled, for a contractor who had a resume for large contracts for a distribution building that was unparalleled, and for a civil engineer that had relationships in that specific area, which was Ontario. They were all support people to me and my focus for this build-a-suit, as opposed to me being a support person for them.
You're just the broker and they're the architect.
Yeah. So I captained that ship, and I had the credibility to captain the ship because I had built it by my story room and by what my focus was. So my client, when they came in, they got value from me, setting them together with the right vendors, the right architect, with the right draftsman. Because a lot of times you can get the right architect, but if he hasn't done the right drafts for those types of buildings, he's learning. The right contractor with the right superintendent, because they had a short timeline. If you don't have a superintendent that knows how to move that job along, you're in trouble on the timeline. So that's value.
Adding value on an upfront basis, obviously. So that turned the tide. There was something you weren't involved in the deal, so he saw that and immediately said, hey.
Well, and then you have to support it. And so I gave him a sheet of paper, and my sheet of paper, very simple, showed him what he could expect on a construction cost per square foot, what the A&E cost would be, what the architecture's cost, the civil engineer's cost would be, what the entitlement cost would be. Totaled it all up so he could see what his finished product cost was going to be. then put a factor on it on a lease. If they were going to own it themselves, then it was just a total cost where they were going to finance it. If they were going to have somebody build it to them, build a suit for them, it was a function of a return on cost. And so I had those yields that, at the time we were talking about a yield around 8%. Today it'd probably be around 6.5, 6.25. But so I gave them the costs ahead of time. I set them up with all the vendors ahead of time. And then when they got the bids back, the bids all matched my numbers because I had already met with them ahead of time, and they couldn't deviate the numbers to try and take advantage of the situation because they had already given me a cost for a hypothesis.